everybody, and welcome to Chapter 32 of Book 2 of the Royal Ranger series, The Red Fox Clan. Let's go ahead and get into it. They had been in the Old Hill Fort for 3 days before the Red Fox Clan launched their attack. An hour after dawn, Gillen was patrolling the walls, as was his custom each morning, when he heard the sound of whistles and bugles coming from the enemy camp. The Fox troops had set up tent lines at the bottom of the hill. Now their men were pouring out of them, forming up on the open space between their camp and the beginning of the winding track that led up to the hill fort. "So they're moving at last," said a voice from close behind him. He turned quickly to see that Horace was there. "Looks like it," he replied. He glanced around the walkway and saw a group of archers a few meters away, watching the preparations below with interest. His senior archer was among them. "Nestor," he called, and as the man looked up, he said, "Over here, please." The grizzled archer walked smartly to him, knuckling his forehead as he drew close. "Looks like they've made up their minds, Ranger," he said. The small garrison of the hill fort had been wondering when the Foxes might gather sufficient courage to attack. "Indeed it does. Deploy your men, Nestor. My guess is the enemy will use the spiral track until they're close to the top, then try to come up the grass slope for the last of the climb." Nestor nodded. He'd come to the same conclusion. Gillen continued, "Problem is, we won't know which part of the hill they'll choose for the final assault until they're committed." "Makes sense for them to attack here at the main gate," Nestor said, jerking his thumb toward the gateway before them. "It's a shorter climb up the grass slope here, and there's no way through the wall on any of the other sides." "You're probably right, but let's put 5 archers on each wall, just to keep an eye on them. If they try to come up the grass slope, they'll be sitting ducks. Rapid shooting from 5 men should slow them down until reinforcements arrive. And if they make their way round to this side, the men from the other walls will have time to reinforce us here." "I'll get on it right away," Nestor said. He touched his forehead again and turned away, calling orders to his men and shouting down into the courtyard below to summon the remainder of his small force. "That's good thinking," Horace said. He had been listening while Gillen issued his orders. "I'll put 2 troopers with your men on each wall as well." He turned and walked away, calling for the lieutenant in command of the cavalry troop. As word of the impending attack spread among the garrison, the yard below became full of men hurrying to their stations on the wall, or buckling on armor and weapons. There was almost a sense of relief among the garrison now that the fight was finally about to start. The uncertainty of waiting for the enemy to attack had been grating on their nerves for the past 2 days. Gillen smiled grimly as he remembered an old saying, "Waiting for the fight is worse than the fighting itself." He checked his own equipment, making sure his quiver was full of arrows, and his sacks and throwing knife were loose in their scabbards. Then he set the end of his bow on the planks, and using his foot as a brace, bent the stave while he ran the string up to slip into the notch at the top of the bow. He flexed the bow once or twice, making sure the string was secured neatly, and that the string itself was in good condition, with no sign of fraying or unraveling. It was an automatic reaction, and quite unnecessary. Rangers were trained to keep their equipment and their weapons in perfect condition at all times. Still, he remembered Halt telling him many years ago, "It's the time you don't check when something will go wrong." Satisfied that he was ready, he moved up the wall once more. He heard the sound of running feet and felt the vibration through the planks of the catwalk beneath him. Glancing round, he saw the small groups of archers and troopers running to take up their positions on the other 3 walls, spacing themselves out to cover the widest area possible. On the south wall, where he stood, was the largest concentration of defenders, 5 archers and himself. That should provide a suitably lethal storm of arrows. And the remaining cavalry troopers formed a strong defensive line along the wall. As he watched, he saw Horace detailing 6 of the latter to empty the ready water barrels down the drains by the gate. The men ran to do his bidding, and several minutes later, Gillen saw jets of water spurting out of the hidden pipes under the track and showering down to wet the grass on the steep slope. "That should slow them up," Horace said, grinning as he returned to Gillen's side. There was a trumpet blast from below, and the two ranks of enemy troops turned right and began to march toward the beginning of the spiral rail. Gillen noticed that they were all carrying body-length shields made from timber, and a group halfway along the column were burdened with long ladders made from roughly trimmed saplings, with the rungs lashed in place with leather thongs and creepers. Obviously, the delay in their attack had been caused by their constructing the ladders and the new shields. They had learned their lesson about the deadly accuracy of the Erluan archers. He counted 5 ladders and estimated their reach. They looked long enough to scale the wall of the hill fort. He checked along the length of the catwalk, where Horace had organized work parties over the past 2 days to pile up stocks of large rocks every couple of meters, ready for use. Glancing round, he studied the men on the other 3 walls. Their numbers were depressingly thin, he thought. If the attackers were well led and persistent, they had a good chance of getting inside the fort. It would depend on where the attack was focused. The defenders simply didn't have enough men to cover all 4 walls. "How many do you think?" he asked Horace, who had been watching the column through slitted eyes. "Maybe 80, he replied. "They're not committing their full force." "They're not being led by their commanding officer either," Gillen replied. He had seen no sign of that officer with his arm in a sling, who had been so vocal several days previously. The man leading the column was younger, more of a warrior than a talker, he thought. He was mounted, and he urged his horse up the steep, uneven track, casting constant glances at the defenders above him, waiting for the onslaught that he knew would come eventually. The head of the column had passed around the hill, out of sight. The rest of the attackers straggled after it. There were gaps in their formation, and they were making heavy work of the uneven ground of the trail, particularly the ladder carriers in the middle of the column. The spiral trail wound clockwise round the hill, and as the trail of the column passed out of sight, the leader of the men on the west wall called a warning. "They're in sight now, still staying on the trail." A few minutes later, the north wall repeated the cry. Gillen nodded quietly. There were still several levels below the top of the trail, faced by steep and slippery grass slopes. They wouldn't attempt to leave the trail yet. "In sight, still coming." That was the east wall. A few minutes later, the column appeared, rounding the hill, on the next tier of the spiraling trail they were following. He sensed someone moving to stand beside him, and glanced round to see it was Nestor. "Try a few shots, Ranger?" he suggested. Gillen considered the idea, then shook his head. "Save your arrows," he said. "When they're on the next tier, we'll hit them with the volley, then rapid shooting." Nestor nodded. He could see the sense in waiting until the enemy were well within range before hitting them with a concentrated rain of arrows. By that stage, they'd be mentally preparing themselves for the final uphill assault. The sight of half a dozen of their comrades tumbling backward, transfixed by arrows, would be a demoralizing one. All the more so because they would have been expecting it for some minutes. The column went round the hill again, and the warning cries from the other 3 walls rang across the empty courtyard. Then the men marching appeared once more, now on the penultimate level below the gate. "Ready, archers!" called Gillen, and the 5 archers assigned to the south side stepped forward to the palisade, knocking arrows to their bowstrings. Gillen did likewise. "Troopers, stand to!" Horace called, and the cavalrymen stepped forward as well, each holding his long lance upright. Designed for use from horseback, they would be well suited to repelling men climbing up the assault ladders, catching them beyond the iron points before they could use their own close-range weapons, axes, swords, and clubs. The attacking force hesitated. Suddenly, the wall high above them seemed to be filled with armed men. The early sunlight glinted on the steel heads of lances and the helmets worn by the troopers. "Archers," Gillen called. "1 volley, then 4 shafts rapid. Ready!" 6 bows groaned slightly as the shooters drew back their shafts, each picking a target in the mass of men below. The archers saw the movement and brought up their shields to cover themselves. "Aim for the gaps," Gillen called. "Shoot!" The bows thrummed with the ugly sound of release, and a few seconds later 6 arrows slammed into the men crouched downhill. 2 of the shafts found their way through gaps in the improvised shield wall, and 2 of the foxes staggered backward, toppling over the edge of the track and tumbling down the grass slope below. The other shafts struck against the shields, but the impact staggered the men holding them. Normally, in a properly formed shield wall, they would be supported by 2 or 3 ranks of men behind them, all adding their weight and thrust to the task of keeping the front line stable. But here, they were on their own and on uneven, sloping ground. Inevitably, several of them staggered and opened the shield wall to the next 4 rounds of shafts, loosed in rapid succession from the wall above them. More men cried out in pain and staggered back, clutching at the cruel, barbed shafts that transfixed them. "Reform the wall!" It was the mounted officer Gillen had noted. He urged his horse back through the struggling mass of men. Gillen took a shot at him, but the man was an experienced fighter, and he had his shield held high to deflect any arrows coming this way. "Face uphill," the mounted man ordered, and the attackers turned to obey his command. "Forward!" he yelled, his voice cracking with the strain, and his men began to struggle up the grassy slope. They slipped and stumbled on the wet, treacherous grass, and more of them were cut down by the archers above as they floundered and struggled, trying to get a foothold. Then the officer, seeing their plight, showed an admirable talent for improvisations. "Ladders here," he shouted, waving a heavy-bladed axe toward the grass slope. The men carrying the ladders struggled along the track and, under his direction, laid the ladders down on the slope. Instantly, the attackers, now with firm footholds, began to swarm up the ladders at 4 points, gathering on the narrow level section below the gate. Sheer weight of numbers told. As more and more men clambered over the wall, the archers lost their cool precision and began to shoot wildly, as fast as they could knock, draw, and release. But too many arrows were striking shields held high for protection. In vain, Gillen sought a clear shot at the man directing the attack, but he had dismounted and was protected by his own kite-shaped shield, as well as the milling mass of soldiers around him. Once the attackers had gained the top level, they dragged the ladders up after them. Gillen peered over the palisade, but beneath him, all he could see was a roof of shields protecting the men below. Then, a ladder slammed against the wall a few meters away, and one of the foxes began to mount it, its limbs trembling under the impact of his feet. He was halfway up when a trooper leaned over and speared him with his lance, sending him toppling down onto the roof of the shields below. Another attacker began climbing the ladder, with a third in place at the foot, ready to follow. Gillen leaned out and shot the man on the ladder, but the next man was already on his way up. Now Gillen could see 4 ladders against the wall. He had no time to look for the 5th, as the attackers, ignoring the rain of rocks and missiles, swarmed up them, swinging weapons wildly at the defenders as they reached the top of the wall. Desperately, the troopers and archers stabbed and shoved at them, driving them back, but the attackers were beginning to get the upper hand. "We need more men," Horace yelled at him, then gestured to the other 3 walls. "Get the other archers over here." Gillen nodded and ran to the inner edge of the catwalk, yelling to his men to join the defenders on the south wall. They came at a run, the increase in numbers easing the burden of the men pushing and struggling at the top of the ladders. Gillen peered over the wall again and saw a now familiar figure mounting the ladder. It was the enemy leader. His shield was held high to protect him. In the other hand, he clutched a heavy axe. He was agile and well-balanced, barely needing to keep a hand on the sides of the ladder as he ran lightly up the treads. Gillen dropped his bow and reached for his sword, but he felt himself shoved aside as Horace took his place. "Let him come," said the warrior. "I want them to see him fall." He had his round buckler on his left arm, the oak leaf motif on it already dented and scarred by multiple impacts from enemy weapons. He waited for the fox leader to reach the top of the wall. His sword, made by Nihanjan swordsmiths many years before, back over his right shoulder. The fox leader suddenly lunged up over the top of the palisade, sending two of the defenders flying with a wide, looping swing of his axe. Behind him, more attackers were poised to swarm over the top of the wall once he had cleared a space for them. As Gillen watched, a movement from the western wall caught his eye, and now he saw what had become of the fifth ladder. It was protruding over the top of the western wall's battlements, and already attackers were clambering over it, driving back the two troopers who had remained behind when Gillen had summoned more men to the south wall. There were already 3 of the foxes on the walkway, and more mounting the ladder behind them when Gillen stepped to one side to clear his line of sight and knocked an arrow to his bow. With almost nonchalant ease, he drew, sighted, and shot, then sent another arrow after that one, and then a third. In a matter of seconds, the 3 attackers sprawled lifeless on the catwalk. The fourth to mount the ladder appeared over the wall, and another arrow slammed into him, sending him toppling back. The fifth peered cautiously over the top of the wall, saw his comrades lying dead, and promptly dropped out of sight. The 2 defenders darted forward and shoved the ladder away into the side, sending it clattering back to the ground below. Gillen let out a long breath. It had been a close call. In the meantime, Horace had stepped forward to meet the leader of the attackers. The man swung the huge axe in a horizontal cut that could have beheaded the tall warrior facing him, if it had hit him. Instead, Horace brought his buckler up, holding it on a slant so that it deflected the axe rather than directly blocking it. The result was that the axeman, not meeting solid resistance, slipped off balance to one side. Now, Horace stepped forward again and brought his sword up and over in a vertical cut. The axeman managed to bring his own shield up in defense, but the massive force of the blow staggered him again. He reeled back against the wall. As Horace went to follow up on his advantage, the man hurled his axe at him. Again, Horace's buckler saved him, sending the heavy weapon spinning away, clattering to the ground below the catwalk. But the delay gave the fox leader time to draw his own sword. Recovering his feet, he hacked wildly at Horace. There was a ringing clash of steel on steel as the 2 blades met. The fox leader grimaced in surprise as his sword met a seemingly unmoving barrier. The shock of the impact ran up his arm, and his blade dropped, only slightly, but enough to give an expert swordsman like Horace a killing advantage. Horace's sword darted out, fast as a striking viper. The super-hardened, razor-sharp blade cut through the man's chainmail overshirt as if it wasn't there. He straightened up and staggered back against the wall once more, and then Horace jerked his sword free and rammed his shield into him. The fox commander fell backward, toppling through the gap between 2 of the crenellations and crashing onto men on the ladder below him. There was a loud cry of despair from the men gathered at the base of the wall. Seeing their best warrior and their leader dispatched with such ease, the attackers lost heart. If he couldn't make it up the ladder, what chance did they have? The foxes began to fall back from the walls, leaving their ladders leaning against them, with the defenders immediately shoving the ladders away. The foxes began to stumble down the grass slope to the next level of the trail. They ran, they slid, they staggered down the wet grass, now wet with blood, as well as water. Within minutes, their retreat had become a panicked rout. Eagerly, the archers took up their bows again, and began to pick them off as they slipped and staggered down the hill. Gillen shook his head wearily, sick of the slaughter. "Stop shooting," he called. "Save your arrows." He turned to Horace, who was cleaning his sword with a piece of cloth. "That was a little too close for comfort," he said. Horace said nothing for a moment, surveying the fleeing army and the litter of bodies on the ground at the base of the wall. "Maybe," but I don't think they'll try it again in a hurry," he said. All right, that's going to be the end of chapter 32. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you all next time in chapter 33. God bless, and have a good one.